let's talk about a major misconceptions about carriers, because we already had a talk with Justin that many people have this weird vision that carriers were neglected in the interwar years by the navies, which is a very broad oversimplification. But there's another one. Basically, people usually say, okay, battleships and cruisers and everything, this was gone like in the beginning of World War II. And there's actually a quite interesting aspect of a book in German about the Luftwaffe, actually made in 1939. And they made a very interesting point about that carriers, because they are not very well armored and there's a lot of fuel and other stuff in them, that they're very sensible. They say, due to the high sensibility of the carrier, this ship has to be protected by all the other ships, and as such it drags down the fleet to a certain degree. And then the final sentence of the paragraph about the carriers is that the last word on the naval warfare still has for quite some time das artillerietragende Großkampfschiff, the artillery carrying
main battleship,
main battleship, main combat ship, or big combat ship.
Literal translation from German here.
So by the way, if you don't know, that's Bismarck from Military Aviation History. I kind of jumped in a bit fast.
That's what we Germans do.
And many people will now say, oh, that's completely stupid. But if you look at what happened in Europe, or in the Atlantic mostly, actually it's not so far off. And I think Simmons pointed out that till 1941, it was actually quite undecided. And if you look at it, HMS Courageous was sunk in 1939 by U-boat U-29. Then HMS Glorious was sunk in June 1940 by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, by battleships or battle cruisers. We don't go into any discussion here because
we're not Drachfinau.
Yeah, and HMS Arcoral in November 1941 was sunk by another U-boat, and HMS Eagle, but that's a bit later, was sunk by another U-boat in 1942. Yeah. So this notion that just because there was a carrier, everything else was destroyed is a bit off. And also there's a difference between the Atlantic and the Pacific as well.
And the Mediterranean as well.
And the Mediterranean.
Because if we go to the Mediterranean, obviously we have to talk about carriers, we have to talk about Taranto, November 1940. You did a video about that as well. And obviously that is a very successful strike, no question about that. And then of course, the counterpoint to that perhaps would also be the German STG 1 and 2 attacking HMS Illustrious, I believe it was, in January 1941. Not sinking her, but damaging her quite severely. And so we're still standing here in Europe, where initially, obviously this document is from 1949, the war. Did it come out just before the war?
I think it came out before the war.
Yeah, clearly. Before the war. There is still this general trend of thinking the battleship is going to be the main decider here. But initially there was really no counterpoint from operational experience either. And because we know what happens throughout the war, and because we know what happens at Pearl Harbor, of course, that big shifting point, Midway, of course.
The Yamato,
yeah. We get this idea of, hey, this was obvious. And it wasn't as much. And if we go into the theoretical discussions, even in the 1920s, 1930s, we can go all the way back, for example, to the US with Billy Mitchell and the war on the Navy. That's actually a really good book written about that as well, where some people nowadays point out, well, he already showed what was going to happen, but it really wasn't that obvious. And that there was a lot of hyperbole by him himself as well. He did himself no favors. He did his cause no favors with his behavior. But we're standing in a situation where things were not quite as clear as sometimes we make them out to be nowadays. And like I said, operational experience kind of mirrored that undecided, even though there is a consensus, but undecided consensus, I would say, on what is going to be the main force on the high seas.
And of course, there's quite a difference, because battleships and battle cruisers and everything in near Europe, to a certain degree, had air cover from land. This is also Drachenifel talks about this in his discussion about armored carriers or not. And this also influences, because in the Pacific the situation is quite different. I mean, of course, you have the islands to a certain degree, but there's quite a difference to a few islands out there, and you're near the German occupied territories and everything. So this, like, the carrier showed up and every battleship and everything was sunk just by carriers is an extreme oversimplification. And I think it's actually worse than what people thought in 1939, that the carrier was just a sideshow, because they couldn't know, and we know now that there was a shift, and it really depends on the circumstances. The carrier is not a win-all weapon. It really depends on the circumstances it's used and everything around. Of course, if you send the Yamato out without proper air cover and everything against an extremely well-trained carrier armada of the US Navy, then the battleship is definitely gonna lose.
It's even with the British battleships that were sunk very early on by the Japanese in 1941.
And Repulse,
So, those...
One of them was a battlecruiser, actually. You
I'm
need
sorry.
to be careful.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm an air guy, not a Navy guy. Anyway, so obviously you can make an argument there, that's obviously a very big sign of things to come. But the operational context of that, there was no air cover for these guys. There should have been air cover. There was supposed to be air cover, and it was, I think, on the way. It just arrived too late. The Japanese were extremely well trained, the squadrons that attacked them. And obviously in a circumstance, in a situation like that, where there was also very much confusion on the side of the British of what was going on, the result that we now think happened, well, the battleships sunk were obviously, but let's take a step back and look at it from the perspective of back then and take into account the operational context, because had there been air cover, maybe only one would have been sunk, or maybe both would have been damaged and not sunk. We don't know what happened, and just because two battleships were sunk does not mean that it immediately invalidated their existence.
And also very important, back then the ships had AA suits that were completely underpowered, because they overestimated, as pointed out for instance in my Bismarck video, that they overestimated how much they can shoot down with the aircraft artillery suits. And so they basically, the question is, what would have happened, for instance, if we put the aircraft artillery suits up there that are like in late war on the battleships? How would the situation then look like? Might be quite different as well.
I mean, if we look at the US Navy, any spare part or spare place on their ships was upgunned at some point with a 50 cal, an Oerlikon, a Bofors, whatever. And there were so many guns on those ships that it's absolutely creating an impenetrable screen. Can't talk anymore. And obviously, if you have more ships doing that, you have this massive. You all know the pictures of these massive air barrages in the sky. The Japanese would have been nice to have Justin here now, or Drachenifel.
It's a bit far.
They're a bit far away now. But they followed, I believe, quite late with this sort of upgunning of their ships. The Germans did it as well quite late, I believe. They had some interesting concepts there. Maybe you can make a video about that at some point. But this whole idea of the aircraft is going to be dominating on the high seas, maybe that turned out to be true in a certain aspect, but you got to take it into consideration, because the Americans perhaps dominated with their planes in the Pacific. But the Japanese, even though were throwing a lot of resources at the Americans in plane-wise, were not having that same success. Why is that? And then you look at the operational conditions and you see, well, the Americans had certain countermeasures in place that the Japanese didn't. And obviously there's going to be different results on these strikes flown.
I mean, wasn't the B-17 intended to be and for anti-shipping operations mainly, but this didn't, for instance, work out. So for instance, you could bring up, you had this great idea of the B-17 for anti-shipping operations. I mean, it turned out to be a great plane, but I don't consider Germany a ship for most part.
Yeah, I mean, the B-17 is this interesting one because it was sort of this token thing, this new plane, this big, massive, captivating everyone. And it was used by the army in this sort of publicity run, where they intercepted an Italian line ship, cruiser, and not a cruiser in the sense of a military ship. A cruiser is a tourist cruiser or a passenger ship. And that was this big, massive thing where they wanted to show the Navy, we can defend our scores. We don't need the Navy, you know. And later on, they did try to do horizontal bombing against Japanese ships on the move and stationary, and it didn't go all that way. I think they had one success, and literally because the Japanese captain looked up and saw B-17s coming towards him and was like, oh, these guys never have hit anything, so I'm just going to stay here. And that was the one case when you know, an American bomber going horizontally actually hit a Japanese
Usually,
ship.
I think they turn just in a circle, right?
Yeah. So, you know, it's ridiculously easy in a certain aspect to evade planes coming from a horizontal platform in a ship. The Japanese probably did it best because they also developed certain tactics to compensate with the fact that a ship is just going to, you know, make an evasive turn. So they flew, they looked at the situation, they flew specific attack patterns to compensate for this fact. The Americans didn't do that, and you know, they got the result that they, I don't want to say deserved, but you know, that's the result you get when you don't take into account the actual operational conditions and the countermeasures that the enemy is going to put in place.
Yeah, and this is the big thing. So just saying, okay, the carrier showed up and all battleships, you can throw them away. And I mean, some people make the point that, oh, they were all ignorant and everything. Nope. Actually not so easy, because look at the battle in the Atlantic and what happened there initially, and you see actually carriers were lost to submarines and even to battleships / battle
initially. Obviously, then you know, you've made this video, so
with
Bismarck gets hit, lucky hit on it. We have cases, of course, where planes do something against German ships. Absolutely, Tirpitz also gets, you know, capsized, let's say. By the RAF, so we are considering those cases as well. But when we take a step back, just evaluate it from the point in time. Let's not pretend like the people in 1940 knew what was going to happen in 1941, 1942, 1943. Yeah, we have to evaluate it from their standpoint. And these aren't idiots. They got to their positions usually by merit. Not always, of course. There are some queer decisions made by people that maybe shouldn't have made those decisions, but usually there was a grounded reason for certain decisions. Might have been the wrong decisions, might have been a very costly decisions, but there was a reason, and we have to consider that. And then we can still say, maybe he should have looked at different evidence. Maybe he should have listened to the other people, but he didn't. But he had his reasons.
And that's actually one point, another article this is a huge book, by the way, so I just printed out something. And in one article they mention, I think there's the discussion, I think it was about like Zerstörerkraft, heavy fighter planes. Yeah. And they were talking like forward firing against turret fighting, like the Defiant. Yeah. And they basically wrote, there's this discussion going on, and we will see in the next war which will turn out the better one. Yeah. So this was like a guy who was a bit more open-minded, and if he had written that, maybe it was the same author like about the carrier, he might have written that like, and it said, right now it looks like the carrier is not going to win, but we will see when a war comes up, and this is usually the thing to go. And this is also the thing with ships. They are big investments. We're talking with ships. It's always build strategy, because it takes years to build them.
It's somebody's got to say something about the Liberty ship here.
That's the combat ship.
Yeah, but turning out building a fleet that is combat ready for the next war is perhaps one of the biggest undertaking a country has to do, because you can change an aircraft within a couple of months even. You can reset production within that time frame if you put your mind to it. You can compensate with a lot of things, provided you have certain contingencies in place, like a good power plant, good weapons, and so on. If you don't have those things, it's going to be difficult. Looking at you, Italy. But for ships, it's completely different. I mean, I think for tanks, it's I don't want to say easy, but relatively easy.
It's also, I mean, just a ship like, I mean, even a small destroyer has like 100 to 300 crew members and the machinery and everything around it. I'm not sure what the fastest was that they put out destroyers, the US, but I think in the end it was like a 100 days or something.
Yeah.
But I might be wrong here, so if I'm wrong, I'll write something down there. But this was insane high speed already. This is just for producing one of these. And the destroyer is rather small if you compare it to a battleship or a carrier. So we're talking about several years here, and this is
also why the escort carriers came to be in a certain sense. I mean, there's many reasons why the escort carrier came to be, but one of them is they're smaller, more easily produced, and you can put them out at a faster rate.
And they're usually converted ships. And also, the British initially, they used their fleet carriers for anti-submarine warfare. And I think at least one of those losses against submarines was on such a mission.
Yeah.
So, but if you have an escort carrier, which can't keep up with your fleet anyway because it's not fast enough, but it can definitely keep up with your convoys, that's a perfect thing. And if you lose an escort carrier, well, it's bad to a certain degree, but nothing compared to losing a fleet carrier.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's the basic point I guess we want to make here is it's always easy to judge in hindsight. And it's always easy to take one big example like Pearl Harbor, Midway, maybe the Bismarck, and just take that as a token thing. And, they should have known. They should have known better. But in reality, things are a lot more complicated, and we ourselves, we're learning, we're reading more, we're piecing all of this together. And what I think we tend to see is just that for many, many bad decisions, there were many good reasons.
I mean, when I started out the channel, I think it was more, I quite often was like, oh, how could they be so dumb, or something along those lines. And now after 3.5 years, for the most part, I usually stay away from any of those judgments because I learned most of these, they were dumb or blaming someone. I learned, well, for most time they had good reasons. And you should not forget, those people back then were usually highly trained, well experienced. These were not like some dudes or something. They were usually pretty top notch, and they usually had their reasons. Of course, sometimes ego comes in and politics or something along the lines, but for most parts we're talking about professionals, and well, we are just civilian historians, or some people in the comment section. It's like maybe they knew a bit more than we do.
They did, probably, most likely.
So I think we hopefully we got the point across.
I think we did multiple times, to be honest.
So the horse is already it's pretty much gone. So thank you for watching, and also thank you for joining.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
And see you next time.
Bye bye.